Trevor Barnes, welcome to the Chiswick Book Festival. At that famous hotbed of spies, the University of Cambridge, Trevor did the next best thing and was a history student. He studied espionage on 1920s Britain and the CIA. He was a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard, and his research was so respected it was published in the Historical Journal. Trevor joined the BBC, even more suspicious, and was a journalist on the Radio 4 Today programme and on BBC Two's Newsnight, after which he became a senior lawyer at media regulator Ofcom. He writes for newspapers and has authored 3 crime novels and a BBC radio play about a Secret Service murder case. And now, cue drum roll, Trevor has published Dead Doubles, called The Extraordinary Worldwide Hunt for one of the Cold War's most notorious spy rings. It's a hugely enjoyable, detailed book, Trevor. Congratulations. First of all, set the scene for us, take us back, 1960, Britain, America, the USSR. Why was spying such a huge preoccupation of governments at this time?
Well, the thing about spying during the Cold War was that, of course, during the Cold War, thank goodness, there wasn't a really serious war other than the Korean War at the start of the 1950s. What you have is this incredibly tense standoff between the exceptionally large, gigantic Soviet Union, which was created after World War II by Stalin on the one hand, and then the West on the other. NATO was created. And so you had this massive standoff, and intelligence, spying, was in effect a kind of surrogate war between these two blocks, trying to weasel out information about the other side. And bearing in mind that the Soviet Union was genuinely behind an Iron Curtain at that time. Very little leaked out from behind the Soviet Union. There was incredible control over the people living within the USSR at that time. We forget that now, living in 2020 with the relative freedom of travel that we have. Of course, the West still remained pretty open, but they were very much on the alert for Soviet spies and penetration, with good reason.
So, well, Portland. This is a little place called Portland off the on the Dorset coast. Paint a picture of Portland for us again at this time, and what was its role? I know it was this small little island, isthmus just off, just near Weymouth. Tell us about it, because it's very different today, and tell us what its strategic role was. Why was it important?
Well, at that time, Britain based all its underwater maritime naval research down on the Isle of Portland. And if you visit it, it's a remarkable piece of land because it hangs, it's like a little isthmus, hangs like a teardrop from the coast. It's all in Thomas Hardy country. And that was where Britain, I say, was developing all its new torpedo research, all its sonar research for both boats, so the sonar on top of ships, and also the sonar in submarines. Now, at that time, Britain had the world's 3rd largest navy, after the Soviet Union and after the US. Of course, now our army is obviously much reduced, and so is our navy. But also at that time, Britain had, and some again may find this a bit hard to believe, we had world-beating technology. And above all, at this centre called the Underwater Detection Establishment, UDE, down in Portland, Britain had created this revolutionary new sonar for our first nuclear submarine. It was called Type 2001, and also it was developing other types of world-leading technologies. And at the same time, the Soviet Union had in 1956 appointed this relatively young, amazing admiral of the fleet called Gorshkov. And he was determined, started off under Khrushchev, to basically turn the USSR's navy into a world-beating force. And he, together with the Kremlin, wanted every single possible secret about the naval developments and technology that the West had. So the KGB were hungry for those maritime secrets from both Britain and from America. But of course, in terms of the UK, a lot of interest in what was going on in Portland.
So put us in the chair of the guy who's running the MI5 operation in 1960. How did they get onto the case?
Well, it started off at the beginning of 1960, when down in Portland, an anti-Semitic letter was received by a man working down there. It was just a letter. It had a swastika on it and the word Jew, and understandably the man who received this was pretty distressed about it, so he reported it to the authorities down in Portland. Now, anti-Semitism was not anything for MI5 to investigate. It was something for the police. But what was interesting was that the man who received this letter said, I think it was this man who works at Portland called Harry Houghton who sent this. And I want to let you know that back in 1956, 4 years before, Houghton was suspected of taking secret files out of the strong room without any authority. So that was the reason why this case came first of all to the attention of MI5 at the beginning of February 1960. But frankly, there wasn't really much evidence to go on. MI5 was getting these vague allegations all the time about people doing something like this. And this also, it wasn't substantiated. It happened 4 years before. But MI5 just started the wheels turning. They asked for a file on this guy, Houghton. And they discovered that, in fact, someone had written to them 4 years before and asked for some information to clear him. It had not gone anywhere. It actually turned out to be rather embarrassing later on for MI5, as we may want to discuss. That was the beginning of the case. So it was just trundling along, and then suddenly, at the end of April, this investigation just jumped from just tiptoeing along to sprinting ahead at light speed. And what was the reason? The answer was top secret information from the CIA. The CIA had got an agent somewhere in Eastern Europe, didn't know the person's name, didn't know where, and he said to the CIA, there is a spy in the British Admiralty. This person was recruited in Poland at the beginning of the 1950s, working in the embassy, in the military attaché, naval attaché's office, got sent back to Britain a year later, and then started working in the Admiralty and was taken over by the KGB. This person's name is something like Hupkenner or Helkenner, began with an H. There was only one prime suspect. That was Harry Houghton. And that was really the beginning of the investigation in a serious way.
So describe then to us what MI5 does, the methods it uses to get onto Houghton. What do they do?
Well, back in 1960, not surprisingly, this was very much an analogue surveillance in an analogue age. So you do all the basic things. First of all, they tapped Harry Houghton's phone in his cottage. They tapped his phone at work. This involved...
And they sent in a gas man, did they?
They normally send someone in who would, or they'd send in a post office GPO, it was then called, engineer, who would say, because the GPO would engineer a fault on the line. So you would say, oh, I've got a fault, can you come in? And they'd take the receiver off and they'd insert something inside. And that was then recorded, and then there was a whole group of women working under a lady called Mrs. Grist, who worked at the top floor in MI5 headquarters. It was called the Gristery, and all these people would sit there with headphones on and they'd do transcriptions of these conversations. So they did that. They also intercepted all his mail, and they also started to find local spies. They found his neighbour, a local policeman with one false eye called Cyril Bogust, who was recruited to keep watch.
He's got a lot going for him.
Absolutely, yeah. And he started feeding back information via the local police. And that was how they started. It was old-style police work in some ways, but all coordinated by MI5. But it did have good results.
So did he say anything that was picked up on these?
Well, what was important was that MI5 discovered from inquiries down there that Harry Houghton had a girlfriend who was also working in the centre down at Portland. Her name was Ethel, and her nickname was Bunty G. She was 46 years old, a spinster, lived with her elderly mum, unbelievably in the same bedroom with her mum, who was aged 86, and two very elderly relatives. And they were basically spending time together, so they discovered that. They also discovered, however...
But she was important, wasn't she?
She was proved to be important in a moment, as we'll discover. Mm-hmm. The key thing that they learned from these interceptions of phone calls and letters was that Houghton was planning to come up to London at the beginning of July 1960 and was going to spend the night in the Cumberland Hotel. So this was when MI5 deployed their next old-style surveillance operation, what were called the Watchers, John le Carre in the MI6 books calls them the Lamplighters. Their real name was the Watchers. And they had a fleet of cars parked in a garage down in Vauxhall, and they had old-style analogue radio messaging between the cars. It was like Z cars, which I remember from my childhood. And they basically trailed Houghton with G, who came up with him, to London. And they were trailed to outside the Old Vic Theatre down near Waterloo. And then they met a mysterious man. And at the time, the Watchers thought he was a Polish intelligence officer called Kowalski. But in fact, when they went and stood guard outside the Polish embassy, it wasn't him. The only clue they had to his identity, because there was no photograph of him, was his number plate of his car. And from that, they discovered that the car was owned by a Canadian businessman called Gordon Lonsdale. And that set in train the next stage of this unfolding inquiry by MI5.
Yeah. So Houghton and Bunty G, they've come to Waterloo Station. They've gone to near the Old Vic. They've met this man who's now identified as Lonsdale. Whether he's identified at this time, I'm not sure. But anyway, they meet him in a little restaurant, a little cafe.
Not quite yet, because what happened was that they met him once. MI5 then found out as much as they could about Gordon Lonsdale. They found out where he was living, in a flat somewhere down in Bayswater. And then they basically started to try and find out more about him from the Canadians. Because the other feature about this is international manhunt. So they discovered from the Canadians that Gordon Lonsdale had this passport. He's meant to have been born in the wilds of Canada. And he had come to Britain in 1955 to study Chinese. Bit strange, but they discover later on there's a very good reason why he studied Chinese. When they went to that restaurant was in fact when Houghton came up alone a month later in August. He was trailed up to London and he went into Steve's restaurant, which is in the Cut, Lower Mast, just opposite the Cut near Waterloo. And you can still see the sign actually. If you go there today, you can still see Steve's Cafe, although it's no longer a cafe. And the MI5 watchers took the big risk to actually go into the cafe. There's the old style thing, with the windows all misting up with evaporation, the old chrome boiler lino on the floor. And they sat so close they could hear the conversation. And they heard Houghton and Lonsdale talk about the next meetings that would be the first Saturday of every month, but also about the, quote, plenty that Houghton said he had in his attaché case for Lonsdale. So at that moment, MI5 thought we're getting closer and closer. Clearly, there is a spy network there.
So investigations are carrying on into who this man Lonsdale is. I mean, what do they know about him at this stage, and who do they think he is?
Well, at this stage, all they know is that he's Gordon Lonsdale, that he has a Canadian passport, and they're starting to collate more and more information about him. But what's mysterious about this Lonsdale is that you have his birth, 1924, you have him coming to Britain in 1955, you have him studying Chinese at SOAS in London, but there's a huge gap. There's nothing about him between the 1930s right through to the 50s. It's as though basically he disappeared from the earth. And immediately MI5 suspicions were aroused because they thought this man is probably what they called a Russian illegal. And the background of this is that the Russian intelligence service has always had two types of spies. They've had the ones who have been operating out of the embassy, who are all, at that time, all KGB. And the advantage of that is that, of course, they have diplomatic immunity. So if they ever got arrested, they can just say diplomatic immunity and they get thrown out, which we saw a few years ago, actually in 2018, after the Skripal affair. There was a mass throwing out of Russian diplomats all around the world. But the other type are called Russian illegals. Now, these are the treasure trove, if you like, for an intelligence service. These are people who are living deep undercover with a completely false identity, which means you hope, as the intelligence service, the KGB, they're not on the radar screen of MI5 or MI6.
So he disappeared off the radar for a number of years. Now he's about to disappear off the radar again, which brings us to a big turning point in the book.
Absolutely. This was the major breakthrough in the investigation. So MI5 have observed Lonsdale. They're tracking him pretty much everywhere. They've worked out that he's selling jukeboxes that he's also involved with another company that's developing a security device for cars to stop them being nicked. But
these are all cover stories, essentially.
These are all cover stories, yeah. I mean, but you have to piece all this together to work out, because you're hoping to find. They're also bugging the phone of the estate agency in Wardour Street in Soho, and they've set up an observation post in the pub opposite. So they're watching him closely. But then at the end of August, on a Friday afternoon, the watchers follow him to a bank, at the Midland Bank branch at 159 Great Portland Street in London. And they see him come in with 3 packages, and they see him come out with nothing. And then he vanishes. He quite literally disappears. MI5 and the police have no record of him leaving the country at all. They immediately contact the Canadians because MI5 have intercepted a phone call at this estate agency in Wardour Street, and they overhear someone he works with saying, Gordon has left, he says he's gone to Canada for 6 weeks. These are the only clues. And so it's a combination of kind of excitement but also panic. A, will he come back? But 2, also a sense of mystery. What is in that safety deposit box?
So this is, for those who haven't, when you read the book, Trevor opens the book with this scene where they're going into the Midland Bank at 159 Great Portland Street. And so tell us what happens and show us your little box of tricks that you brought along to illustrate it.
Well, it's a really big deal for MI5 because, of course, you know, this is the safety deposit box in a private bank.
Well, they have to get permission, don't they, from the chairman
Well, they
of the
do.
bank?
I mean,
Yeah.
MI5 did not get a search warrant to do this. So technically, by modern legal terms, it would be a burglary. But what they do is they go to no less a person than the permanent secretary, the top civil servant in the Treasury, and he goes to the chairman of the Midland Bank. And the Midland Bank says, OK, very special reasons, national security, you can do it, but I want a full indemnity. If there's any problems, I want all my problems covered by MI5 and the government. So they go in on a Friday afternoon and they pick up these 3 objects. They come with 2 bank employees to the top secret laboratory that MI5 has near St Paul's Cathedral. You can imagine the scene, all the strip lamps all up, the desks, cameras there. They even get a special, what's called unpacker and putter back from MI6, who's a specialist in this unpacking and putting back. And they
go in and they stuff that's really quite delicate. They've got very light fingers. They will unwrap it, look at it, inspect it, and then wrap it all back up together, put it all back together, and as though you'd never know it had been touched.
That's the idea, and of course it's very complicated work because if you've got a Russian illegal, he's always on the lookout for anything that might be a clue to the fact he's under observation. So they didn't want to leave a single clue that they had touched anything on these 3 packages. Anyway, they opened them up. There were 2 cases and a deed box. A lot of the stuff was actually private stuff about the jukebox business, accounts. There were also photographs, which in themselves were quite interesting, chartering the life that was led by Lonsdale. But strangely, I mean, there was nothing there that really was a giveaway saying this man is a KGB spy. Until the main MI5 investigator, a very interesting man called Charles Elwell, very bright, absolutely superlative counter-espionage investigator. He spotted this, which was an old-style Ronson cigarette lighter. And he said to his colleagues that why on earth would Lonsdale bother to put a cigarette lighter in his safety deposit box? Something fishy here. So they put it under an X-ray machine and they discovered it was hollow. So then they thought we'd investigate it further. And what they found was that if they unscrewed the top, like this, underneath was a piece of green baize and a screw. You could take it out, and essentially inside was a treasure trove of KGB irrefutable proof goodies. There were a set of encoding pads, miniature encoding pads, which the KGB used to send messages that would be indecipherable without having the key to it, plus also a little map of 8 roads in Kingston in southwest London, which is obviously the place where the spies, would meet and have rendezvous to pass over material. So at that moment, MI5 had irrefutable proof that this man was working for the KGB. Gordon Lonsdale was a KGB illegal spy. On the 18th of October, he reappeared. So that obviously you can imagine the kind of collective sigh of relief that he had come back. And then MI5 started tracking Lonsdale again. He'd taken a flat near Regent's Park in what's now the Malia Hotel, the big white building built in the 30s. The old White House Hotel, yeah. Exactly, the old White House Hotel. You can still see the bedroom window, which was occupied by Lonsdale there. And he kept disappearing in the evenings, going out further and further to the northwest of London. And MI5 were terribly afraid that Lonsdale would spot them, or that the Russians were able to intercept the radio messages of the watchers. So they took a long while to work out where he was going.
But then they do find out, and we're getting closer and closer to Chiswick here, folks. Tell us about what happens, where they find him.
Well, it's very exciting. They essentially, MI5, set a series of people to follow him just a little bit further every night. And then, at the end of October, they follow him out to Ruislip Manor underground station, and Lonsdale, gets out and they tail him, and he walks to a little close where there's a passageway which leads to a road called Cranley Drive. You've got to remember this is November, so it's dark, so after summertime has ended, and the MI5 watchers couldn't risk following him because they thought he's a highly trained illegal. He might just be waiting at the end of this passageway. We know where he's gone, but we haven't yet established where he's actually ended up. So MI5 at that point decide they must set some what are called observation posts, or OPs in the MI5 acronym, up. And what they do is they go across the road to where the passageway ends, to number 1 Courtfield Gardens. And if you go to Cranley Drive in Ruislip today, you can still see the two houses. You can see the one where the observation post was set up, and the line of bungalows opposite. And it was in one of those that they found he went. And what happened was that they went into 1 Courtfield Gardens. The family called the searchers said, yes, you can use our daughter's bedroom. And they kept watch from there. A couple of young female MI5 officers used to pitch up every day, and they kept watch from there. And then one Sunday afternoon, when one of them was downstairs, outside, through the bay window, they saw Gordon Lonsdale emerge from the front door of 45 Cranley Drive, and they thought, gotcha.
And just as an aside, what is the name of the 14-year-old girl whose bedroom they were in?
A lady called Gay Search, who became an eminent producer in the BBC, and she's been interviewed a few times about this event and what it was like actually for her parents having these watchers based in their house, because it's very, very tense. And I discovered from the son of Charles Elwell, the MI5 investigator, a completely new story I was unaware of, which was that as a result of the tension that was building up, Mrs. Search wanted to be able to tell her friends that she had these people staying. And the tension built up as well to such an extent that they were talking, she and her husband, of asking MI5 to leave. And so the MI5 investigator organised a drink one evening in a local pub with Mr. Search, basically to try and learn if there was a problem and persuade him not to kick out MI5. And Charles Elwell had to take a decisive and important, momentous decision, because it was clear to him that the searchers were probably going to throw them out. So he decided to tell them much more about the case than normally would have happened. He clearly would have mentioned the Official Secrets Act, but clearly would have told them, look, we think this man, Gordon Lonsdale, who comes to that house opposite, might be working as a spy. And so that convinced them, and MI5 could stay. You've got two different colliding interests. You've got MI5 that were obviously wanting to make this operation carry on as long as possible, because they're hoping all the time that it will lead them to further spies. They've already now got 5 on their radar screen. But
because
of course,
we've got Houghton, we've got G, we've got Lonsdale, and we've got the couple who we haven't actually named yet, who are living in the bungalow. Yeah.
They were a couple called Peter and Helen Kroger. And Peter Kroger gave a front of being an antiquarian bookseller, and his wife Helen of being a housewife. And he was, a very effective antiquarian bookseller. He'd been to the auctions, he bought books. He first of all set up in the Strand, had a little shop, then decided to live at home and work from home. They knew all the local people in the area, like the Searchers, Gay Search, remembered Mrs. Kroger walking down the street, being very daredevil for her time, wearing slacks, trousers, and whistling, through her mouth, sort of thing that the stately ladies, in anonymous Ruislip did not do at the time. She was a very colourful character. So they had 5 people, but the thought was they might lead, MI5 to others. They wanted it to run. On the other hand, as you've just said, the Admiralty were really scared that further secrets would be leaked. But of course, if you restricted the flow of secrets, obviously, to G and to Houghton, then that could arouse their suspicions.
Yeah. So just to recap again, we've got the 2 people working at Portland at this stage. Clearly seem to be handing over some sensitive material about the underwater defence establishment. You've got the so-called Canadian Lonsdale, who's a suspected Soviet deep embedded spy, and you've got this mystery couple out in Ruislip who Lonsdale is going to every now and then for reasons we don't know. You've got watchers there trying to get hold of it. So it's all rumbling on. The Admiralty wants the police and MI5 to act now. MI5 are saying, hang on, this could lead us to bigger fish, or wait. But then something else dramatic happens at the start of 1961. What's that?
Yeah, the year turns, so we start a new decade in 1961. And suddenly, on the 4th of January 1961, 400 miles away to the east in Berlin, the CIA headquarters in Berlin gets a message saying, the CIA agent who you might remember back in April 1960 gave the original key clues to MI5 pointing to Houghton, codename Sniper. Sniper said, I'm going to defect. I'm going to defect tomorrow. As you can imagine, that set alarm bells ringing. Not only in Berlin, because they had to organise the reception party for him, and ensure that there'd be a flight, get him out, way of checking his identity, but also thinking about the implications for all the intelligence that this man Sniper would have handed to Western intelligence. Because clearly, as soon as he defected, Moscow Centre, in other words, the KGB headquarters, would say, comrade, we have some real problems here. What information has he passed to the West? Probably we must get all our agents who are at risk out.
So suddenly Lonsdale looks like, as far as the Russians are concerned, looks like he might be rumbled. They've got to get him back to Moscow.
Exactly, and not just him, but the Krogers. Yeah. Because by this time, MI5 is thinking that probably their role is as the communications operators, the people who actually to whom Lonsdale's handing the information, and then they're getting it out of London either by means of little microdots, or by radio communication, or by dead drops, leaving packages in secret places for the Russian embassy to pick up. But they're in league with him. So, indeed, the real worry is that you will find at least the 3 KGB illegals, the 2 Krogers and Gordon Lonsdale, with a flick of the tail, just disappearing from the UK. So, what does this mean? Answer, CIA tell MI6, MI6 tell MI5, alarm bells go in what was called Leconfield House, the MI5 headquarters in Curzon Street in Mayfair. Crisis meetings held, decision, we've got to arrest the whole of this network as soon as possible.
And as it happens, Houghton and G were due to meet Lonsdale in a couple of days' time anyway.
Absolutely. It was actually incredibly fortunate for MI5 because due to intercepted communications with Houghton, mail, they're also by this time bugging Lonsdale's phone, by the way, and communications in his house. And also GCHQ, our code-breaking agency, played a key role in this case. That hasn't really fully come out yet. GCHQ with MI5 were intercepting the radio messages, not all of them, as far as we can work out, but a number of them between Lonsdale and Moscow. So what happened was that they said, right, we must arrest them. and they decided to do it on that Saturday when Houghton and G came up to London. And so the scene was set. Planning meetings were held, and the day dawned, and that was the day of the arrest, Saturday the 7th of January 1961.
Okay, and I think we have a clip of a film from the US Department of Defense which tries to recreate the dramatic scene of that day. Let's have a look at that.
First to be sighted was Lonsdale as he parked his car on a side street. It was perfect timing, for just ahead were Henry Houghton and Ethel Keane. While the agents watched, Lonsdale reacted as though recognizing some old friends and hurried up to catch up and greet them. As soon as the shopping basket changed hands, British security agents made their move.
And then it's back to Ruislip, 45 Cranley Drive, because of course the Crogers were not at Victoria Station. What happens? What happened? What's the action back there, back in Ruislip?
Well, the MI5 investigator Charles Elwell had planned it very carefully, that once they'd got the three spies, Lonsdale, Houghton and G, in the bag, they would go out to Ruislip that evening at the time that they thought Lonsdale would normally arrive there to pass on to the Krogers the secrets to be sent on to Moscow. So having got those three spies into New Scotland Yard, obviously immediately searched. Lonsdale's flat, by the way, was then searched. They found caches of dollars. They found still his cigarette lighter with the codes and all that sort of stuff there. They all drove out, small convoy out to Ruislip. This is about 7 o'clock in the evening. Quiet. Basically, the bungalow was pitched out and surrounded by a combination of policemen and MI5 agents in case the Krogers decided that they'd do a runner. And at about 7 o'clock, the man from Special Branch, Superintendent George G. Smith, went up to the front door with his assistant and knocked on the door. And you can imagine the light in the hall goes on, and there is Peter Kroger standing there with his shock of white hair standing in the doorway. And you've got to bear in mind, he's a really cool customer, so he invites them into the front room. His wife, Helen Kroger, appears, and the policeman then drops his, what turns out to be a conversational bombshell, because he says, we are the police. We are trying to find some information about a man who comes to visit you regularly at weekends. Can you tell me who comes to visit you at the weekends? And the Krogers obviously internally panic. They go through a whole load of names, but one of them is not Lonsdale. So at that moment, they arrest them. But Mrs. Kroger at that moment said, oh, can I just go and stoke the boiler, please? And I want to pick up something from my bedroom. But a very clever detective woman constable accompanies her, called Annie Winterbottom. And as Mrs. Kroger goes into the bedroom, she sees that she picks up her handbag and then starts moving towards the kitchen. And that she points basically to the handbag. So the superintendent says, can I look in your handbag? And Mrs. Kroger basically tries to resist him looking in it. There's a bit of a tussle. The superintendent takes it, opens it up, and inside are glass slides, microscope slides with microdots in, a manuscript letter in Russian, and also the bit of paper with the 8 roads map in Kingston that hopefully a few of the people watching this might remember was in the cigarette lighter in the safety deposit box. Again, more crucial evidence. So Krogers are again arrested and taken back to the yard.
But they found a trapdoor. How did they find the trapdoor?
Well, obviously, having got the Krogers into custody, the process begins of searching the whole of their bungalow. And the police start doing it, and they find various things. They find another cigarette lighter that's hollowed out with codes inside. But what MI5 and the police can't find is the basically jewel in the crown. MI5 are convinced that there must be a radio somewhere which is being used by the Krogers to communicate with Moscow. And they look and they look and they look for over a week and they can't find it. After about a week, however, someone spots a light attached to a long lead, and they discover in the kitchen, underneath the old-style gas oven, if you move it and the line over's pulled up, a trapdoor. They open it up, there's a half cellar. They start looking there, can't find anything there. But then a couple of top MI5 investigators come along, and in 2 hours they look around, and after a couple of hours they spot that some of the concrete has been disturbed, and there they see what seems to be the outline of a little kind of very small, could be a door, could be a little ledge. They open it up, pull that out, that's basically a kind of lid, and inside is a carefully concealed concrete hiding place, and inside was this amazing radio, what's called flash transmission equipment. So again, great moment of eureka. We've finally got, say the jewel in the crown.
So a basement in Ruislip was essentially taking all the information in from Moscow and transmitting information back to Moscow as well.
I mean, this equipment was then sent out to Cheltenham, to GCHQ, who looked at it, and they said this is the absolute state-of-the-art stuff for the time. I mean, nowadays in 2020 it would look incredibly old hat, but this was absolutely leading edge stuff. And with it, you could basically take a message that if you needed 20 minutes to send by Morse, you could encode it onto a tape, press one button, another button, and it was sent off to Moscow in a matter of seconds.
So we've got 5 people arrested on espionage charges. A trial comes up pretty quickly. It was fascinating in your book to read just how much information was actually decided to keep back from the trial, to keep back from the jury because of the sensitivity. Just talk us through the politics of all of that.
Well, one of the key bits of information that was kept back from the jury was who 2 of the defendants really were. Because you remember the 2 people living, in Ruislip in 45 Cranley Drive, who were meant to be Peter and Helen Kroger, who said they told neighbours Canadian. When they were arrested, they turned out to have New Zealand passports. But it didn't end there, because when they were arrested, they refused to allow their fingerprints to be taken. So after 2 days, the court ordered their fingerprints to be taken. And indeed they were. Scotland Yard took them back to their fingerprint bureau. And after about 48 hours, there was a ka-ching moment, because there, on their files, were the fingerprints sent around the world by the FBI 2 years before of 2 leading KGB spies they had been searching for since the early 50s, whose names were Morris and Lona Cohen. And there's a whole story about how the FBI knew about them, but essentially the FBI had been searching for them around the world intensively for 3 years, less intensively for years before, and these were the 2 spies masquerading as an antiquarian bookseller and his wife in Ruislip, who MI5 unknowingly had caught in their net.
So briefly, just take us through what happened at the trial, and then, as you say, we don't know who Lonsdale is yet. Tell us then how we find out who these people really are.
Well, the trial created headlines around the world. I mean, the only news agency that wasn't represented was, surprise, surprise, from TASS in Russia. They did not come to the trial, but every other major nation did send journalists. Special balustrade was built inside the Old Bailey for an extra number of journalists. It was headline-making stuff. The evidence was pretty overwhelming, obviously, against the 5 spies, because you've had all this stuff that had been accumulated. Houghton came into the witness box along with G, and they decided that G was going to say, I was infatuated by Houghton, and I had my arm twisted to do all this, and really I was just an innocent pawn. And Houghton played along with that and said, I basically put the screws, so to speak, on my girlfriend to do it. She's a bit of an innocent. Interestingly, Lonsdale and the Krogers decided they wouldn't go in the witness box. They simply said that they will make statements at the end of the at the end of the trial. I mean, interestingly, Houghton's evidence was so lunatic and exaggerated in parts that Lonsdale laughed when he was listening to it, because Houghton said, I was beaten up by the KGB or these uncertain people from Eastern Europe. I was kind of under duress made to give these secrets. But the jury weren't convinced. Jury were out 45 minutes, came back in. The Lord Chief Justice, because it was he no less who presided, decided, along with the government, I think, behind the scenes, that they needed to make a real example of these 5 spies. So Lonsdale was given 25 years, the Krogers were each given 20 years each, and the 2 British spies were given 15 years. And just before the sentencing, Superintendent George Smith from the Yard went into the witness box and revealed to the jury who the Krogers really were. And obviously, as the scales fell from the jury's eyes, there were gasps from not only the well of the court, but also from the jury box.
There were a couple of communists from the East Coast of America.
These were really serious spies, and I think it probably made a number of jury people who may have had possibly a few doubts think, thank goodness we convicted.
And of course, they didn't serve their full sentences. They were exchanged for British men who'd been taken prisoner in the Soviet Union. There were exchanges, quite dramatic exchanges went on.
The spy swaps that emerged from the Portland spy ring were some of the highest profile spy swaps of the whole of the 1960s, classic John le Carre territory. The first one involved Gordon Lonsdale. He had various conversations with Elwell in jail, and Elwell hoped that he'd be able to turn Lonsdale and get him to spill some secrets. And there was a big battle between MI5 and the government to essentially make a sufficiently generous offer to Lonsdale to agree. And they even leaked his real identity when they found it via the newspapers to try and put pressure on him. It didn't essentially work because the British government wasn't willing to make a generous enough offer. So there seemed to be stalemate at the end of 61. But then the Russians, meanwhile, were very aware of the need to have more powder in their sort of locker to negotiate. And this happened when you had the arrest at the end of 63 of a man called Greville Wynne in Hungary. Now, he was operating as the MI6 courier to take secrets from a man in the Russian intelligence called Penkovsky, absolutely crucial secrets out to the West. Essentially, Penkovsky got betrayed. He revealed the name of Wynne. Wynne was arrested, and the Russians said, right, we now have the piece on the international chessboard to put pressure on the Brits. And that's what they did. And an exchange was arranged in April 1964 for Greville Wynne to be released in exchange for Gordon Lonsdale, whose real name was Conlon Molody.
So, and the Krogers, they were also exchanged?
The Krogers were exchanged, that was 5 years later. Essentially, the Russians needed more pieces on the international chessboard again. So they were very clever at manipulating public opinion in Britain. And essentially what they did was set up a British man called Gerald Brooke and his wife, who was a Christian, who was trying to take Christian literature and other material inside this hermetically closed USSR. And they arranged some meetings with Russian people, and the Brookes had put some literature inside the cover of a magazine. And of course, what happened was they opened the magazine, and at the moment they did that, surprise, surprise, men from the KGB appeared. And Brooke was imprisoned in a really tough labour camp. His health was declining. The Russians, of course, made sure this was all leaked to the British newspapers. And in the end, a swap was exchanged. But because the Brits were very aware that essentially they were swapping a pawn for a king and a queen on the international espionage chessboard, in the end, Harold Wilson's government got it so that the Brooke was released first, and then the Krogers were released several months afterwards. But the two were clearly linked.
So, Trevor, in researching this book, and it's fantastically researched. I mean, it's amazing. It's like you're reading official papers sometimes. But you know, it's taken you to Washington. It's taken you to New York. Clearly, all the main reference points in London. But you also went to Moscow as well.
I did, yeah. In some ways, that was one of the reasons why I was keen to do the story, because with a lot of spy rings, there's no chance to get the Russian angle, because the KGB, in most cases, has not opened up any of their archives at all about particularly post-war spy cases. So you won't get anything about the George Blake case, or let alone more recent cases out of Russia. But it so happened that they had released a limited amount of material in the 1990s. And I thought I would basically approach the Russians to see if they might offer me some assistance. So I got my brilliant Moscow researcher to write to the press bureau of the modern KGB, because surprisingly or not, they do have one. And in fact, it was in this building here. I went to go and...
Let's see the bag. Pull the bag up. Let's see the bag.
So the modern KGB, the Foreign Intelligence Service, is called the SVR, and it's based in this remarkably elegant Napoleon period villa.
What does the Cyrillic say at the top? What does that say?
This says Press Bureau SVR, Russia. So this is their press bureau. And it's under Vladimir Putin, been beautifully redecorated. And outside they have a statue of the wartime head of the KGB, who was in charge of the amazing getting out of Los Alamos, all the secrets about the atomic bomb. And anyway, I wrote to them, and much to my amazement, they said, come and see me, the head of the press bureau. This bottle of vodka that's got exactly the same, the logo. And I find it amusing stroke intriguing that MI6, of course, which is the equivalent of the SVR, has no press bureau. And certainly, as far as I'm aware, they don't give you goodie bags when you go there. And the other thing they gave me was this catalogue for a fascinating exhibition that was held in Moscow in 2017. It was called Golden Spies of Russia, because the thing I discovered was that these spies in the Portland spy ring, the three, namely Lonsdale, real name Conor Molody, Lohner and Morris Cohen, they are heroes of the Soviet Union. They were honoured by having postage stamps issued in their name, and inside the Golden Spies you find Lohner Cohen on one side and Morris Cohen on the right. And separately, in a special secret private ceremony, Vladimir Putin described the other spy in the ring, the KGB illegal Conor Molody, as a legend. He said it's on legends like these that the Russian Secret Service was founded. So it's a very active kind of use of spies in modern Russia as icons, really, of kind of what you should aim for. They're contemporary heroes. They're not just figures from history.
And the two British people, Houghton and Gee, the people who lived in Portland, what happened to them?
Well, again, Charles Elwell, the MI5 guy, came to visit them in jail, and they decided not to cooperate at all. Houghton tried to play games a little bit with Elwell. Gee just refused all cooperation. And in fact, interestingly, the MI5 bugged a meeting which they organised and allowed between Houghton and Gee. And it's perfectly clear from that that Gee's fear was that if the real truth of her espionage were known, she might have another jail sentence imposed on her. Because the reality was that the full truth of their espionage was not revealed in court in their trial in 1961. So, for example, the fact that MI5 knew pretty conclusively that Houghton had volunteered to work for the KGB in 1951, and he'd been spying for them from 1951 right through to the arrest of him and Gee in 1961, a decade later. That Gee knew that she was working for the KGB and did it for money and actively worked with Houghton, and by all accounts didn't need any persuasion whatsoever.
But their motivation then was money rather than ideology, these two?
It was, yeah. I mean,
and how much do we think they actually did leak? How many documents? How important were they?
Well, the KGB in the 1990s did surprisingly release a number of documents from the files of Houghton and Gee. and allowed these to be published. I won't go into the details of how and why, but they did. But those documents reveal that Houghton shared industrial quantities of documents with the Russians when he was in Warsaw and in his early period at UDE. There were thousands of documents. So a lot of the top secrets about sonar of Britain in that period were leaked. The really important secret that G shared with the Russians, stole and was given to Lonsdale, was about the world-beating sonar for Britain's first nuclear submarine called the Type 2001. And this really was world-beating. And it was so good, in fact, the French wanted and asked the Brits for use of it, and the Brits said no. The Americans were very impressed by it as well. But the other thing I found out was that there were clearly other spies in the network that were not caught.
Yeah, but just before that, I'd read a figure in your book about just how much money they reckon they'd saved the Soviet Union.
Well, no one quite knows, because of course, you know, there are lies, damn lies and statistics, but it was almost certainly millions of pounds, tens of millions of pounds in terms of research costs. I mean, the Russian source is not very reliable. They talk about it being hundreds of millions of rubles. So it was a large amount of money. And in fact, the KGB agent who ran Lonsdale before he was passed over, before Houghton and G were passed over to Lonsdale, a man called Dozhdalev was interviewed in the Soviet Union, and he said essentially it was like industrial espionage. The USSR got these secrets from Houghton and G, and as a result it saved us an immense amount of research and development costs. And then when the British nuclear submarine people were tracking the new class of Soviet submarines, because I interviewed 2 former British nuclear subcommanders, that was the moment when, beyond doubt, the British Navy discovered that the secrets had been stolen, because they, in their headphones, these commanders could hear for the first time the same sonar signature, the same beep, 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 and they said, this is the same as ours. And in fact, a lot of wags in the Royal Navy, they called the Russian sonar, they called it 2001-ski, because it was just a rip-off of the British radar.
And just wrapping up, I mean, how do we think this was the extent of the spy ring? Do we think Lonsdale was running more people?
No, although we don't know the names, if you pull all the evidence together from different sources, in my opinion, it's beyond reasonable doubt there were other spies in the ring. We know as a matter of fact that there was one, a woman called Melita Norwood, called the Granny Spy, and she was passed to Lonsdale to run for about 6 weeks. But she was a convinced communist and thought that Lonsdale was too much of a playboy. So she asked to go back to her usual handler from the Russian embassy. That's not new. But in the Russian sources, they talk about a mysterious Agent K, who was clearly different to Melita Norwood, who handed over a series of important industrial and other secrets to the Brits. Secondly, there's pretty good evidence that the KGB, through Lonsdale, penetrated Porton Down, the chemical and biological centre, and got the secret of CS gas, which the British had developed there. And secondly, certain bacteriological and chemical weapons out of there as well. I think very probably the secret of the VX nerve agent, which the Brits were the first to synthesize in the early 50s and became later Novichok, which of course was used to poison the Skripals. And there were also a number of other agents as well, whose names we don't know. I mean, none of them, I think, were world-changing in terms of their secrecy, but it would certainly be fascinating to know the identity of at least Agent K, and until the KGB SVR now is open its archives, we're not going to know.
Well, it's an amazing little story at the heart of an amazing book. As I say, brilliantly researched and written by my long-term colleague and friend Trevor Barnes. Please buy Dead Doubles when you can. You won't be disappointed. Trevor Barnes, thank you.
Thank you.